Good afternoon and welcome to Sharing the Cost, Insights from States Funding Dual Enrollment to Expand Access. I'm Carrie Wandler. I'm the Senior Director of Policy Initiatives at the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. And I'm pleased to have Krista Kaput, Senior Analyst from Bellwether, join us today to share insights and lessons learned from their 2025 report. Before we begin, there's a few housekeeping items I wanted to mention. We're recording this session and we'll post the recording to our website after the presentation. We welcome questions and we ask that you use the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer all of them throughout the course of the presentation. And please also take our survey at the end so we can improve upon future webinars and events. I'm especially excited for this topic because, as many of you know, MEC had a dual enrollment state policy workshop over the summer, and funding was one of the key topics that state teams were interested in learning more about, and also just individuals working in the field. And so I really am excited that Krista is here. So before we hear from Krista, I wanted to give a little background. She is the senior analyst at Bellwether, where she focuses on a wide range of educational issues, including state, special education, and higher education funding, as well as teacher preparation, college and career readiness, and early childhood education. She previously served as research director for Ed Allies, where she spearheaded a number of research projects. A former special education teacher and Teach for America alum, Krista brings classroom experience and policy expertise to her work advancing educational opportunity. So I think I can turn it over to Krista now for the presentation.
Thank you, Carrie. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today. So as Carrie previewed, I'm going to be talking about a paper that we published earlier this year called Sharing the Cost. How this is going to work is I'll try to talk for only about 20-ish minutes. As a former teacher, I don't like to drone on for too long, and then turn it to you all to ask questions. So if you could please, as Carrie said, put your questions in the Q&A. Then we'll get to those at the end. And then also we have a couple poll questions for you to respond to as well. And we'll be looking at that. So with that, I'll get started. So as Carrie mentioned, I work for an organization called Bellwether. We are a national nonprofit that work with a variety of organizations, other nonprofits, state education organizations, advocates, state legislators, on a number of research projects to help their impact, inform, influence policy and program design, and share what we learn along the way. But I'm also on a subset at Bellwether, a team called our State Education Finance Initiative. So we do a lot of work working with states to help inform their policy and practice. So helping them analyze and explain their state funding formulas, how they can improve them. We provide some trainings for advocates in terms of thinking about how they can analyze their own state funding formulas and data, and then some policy advising and technical assistance. So that's just a little background about Bellwether, who we are, how we come to this work. And if you're interested in the report, you can scan this QR code or go to that link. The report's there along with an executive summary. But now the good stuff. Let's dig in. So poll question. Before we get started, I just was kind of wondering, getting a sense of who's in the room, just like what do you all think are the top 1 to 2 barriers to dual enrollment access and participation in your state? Is it information? Is it cost? You can put like A/B or something like that. Is it cost? Instructors, there's just not enough qualified dual enrollment instructors in your state. Geography, is it just that there's a lot of rural districts and it's hard to get programming there? Other or not sure. So I'm going to pause here for a minute, see what people are thinking. I'm seeing it. Okay, I'm seeing information, instructors. Instructors is a big one we've heard. Okay. Geography, yep. Seen a lot of instructors. Yeah, cost. Yep, AP versus dual enrollment, that's fair. Yeah, this is great. Thank you all. This is helpful. I'm seeing a lot of instructors, cost, information, a combination of everything, which isn't surprising because depending on where you are, right, you have different things. But we'll talk through at the end of our report, because while I focus on like the funding formulas and how the costs are shared, We also found that, non-funding policies that are directly related to funding, like qualified instructors in geography, um, are huge barriers to access as well. So thank you all for that. So moving on. There we go. So goals and research questions. So before I kind of dig everything in, I want to set the foundation. So when we were thinking about this project, we were kind of thinking about, okay, why focus on dual enrollment funding? This is actually a newer area for Bellwether. We hadn't done really work on dual enrollment before. I had done work previously when I was at Allies in Minnesota with the P20 partnership, and so really was interested in the marrying of the K to 12 space and the higher education space. And so since I did that work in Minnesota, there's just been much better like data and information that's come out. And so dual enrollment, about 16% of high school students participate in dual enrollment nationwide. That's an increase of 2 million students since 2015. And there's more recent data that's come out, and we know that number is even larger. We know from research that dual enrollment participation improves student outcomes, high school graduation rates, college enrollment, post-secondary attainment. However, we know that like many of our systems, like when we look at participation, there is participation in dual enrollment has historically been inequitable, where we're seeing more white, more affluent students participate at higher rates than other systemically marginalized students. And we also know, and I know this from working in K to 12 finance, dual enrollment funding and policies vary significantly across programs and states. Even though states call them dual enrollment or dual credit, the way that they fund them and the way that they provide minimum like requirements for participating, things like that varies greatly. And so we kind of wanted to hone in on some of this to identify some common themes. And so the goal of this paper was to help state leaders, policymakers, and advocates better understand how states use these funding models to increase dual enrollment accessibility and to provide state leaders and policymakers with some clear design options and considerations to help them evaluate their current approaches and to perhaps make some changes. And so we had three main research questions. What are the characteristics of dual enrollment funding models that aim to support more accessible dual enrollment program participation and student outcomes? How do these models share dual enrollment tuition and non-tuition costs across four stakeholders: the state, community colleges, K-12 districts, and students? And we focus on community colleges because community colleges make up about 72% of all dual enrollment students nationwide. So that's why we focused on them. And then also, what are some of the program growth and attainment outcomes in these state programs that have tried these different dual enrollment funding models? And so before I go into the states we looked at in our case studies, I really want to set the foundation of who are we thinking about when we're thinking about the main actors that are sharing these dual enrollment costs. So we have state governments. So some states fully cover or partially offset student tuition for dual enrollment or other non-tuition costs. You have community colleges. So if a state does not fully cover the tuition on tuition costs, community colleges and K-12 districts have to then share those costs through often through memorandums of understanding. Or they can also, the district or the community college could defer some of those costs to students as well. And so when we're thinking about dual enrollment costs, we're referring to both tuition, so what students are charged to actually take those college courses, or non-tuition costs like fees, textbooks, supplies, meals, transportation, as I'm sure all of you in this room know about. And so we analyzed how these four players share these costs, and we found that there's a lot that states must consider about how K-12 districts and community college will work together to cover dual enrollment expenses. And so for K-12 districts, every state has its own distinct K-12 funding formula that allocates funding based off either student enrollment or student attendance. And we found that states generally allocate some or all of that funding, K-12 education review allocation, to those dual enrollment, to those districts for dual enrollment students. And then through those memorandums of understanding, MOUs, districts, community college work together to then figure out how those how those costs are split. And then on the community college side, states generally allocate some or most of their community college formula funding based off of full-time equivalents, so FTEs, number of students enrolled. And many states have incorporated dual enrollment students into their community college FTE counts. And then some states also provide additional supplemental funding on top of the regular formula funding for dual enrollment. So some states have like dual enrollment grants or things like that to help cover costs that are outside of those K-12 and community college formulas. So thinking about this entire system as a whole, there are different pros and cons, right, for these different cost sharing structures. So when state allocations cover costs for students, that encourages dual enrollment participation, particularly for systemically marginalized groups. And when states don't invest in dual enrollment, it can serve as a financial deterrent because students who can't, frankly, afford to take those classes don't, or if districts or community colleges can't afford to reduce tuition prices or to supplement that funding. For K-12 districts, by the state allocating additional funding, it eases the district cost of offering dual enrollment because even if a student is taking dual enrollment, the district still has to pay for, counselors and other things to account for that student, even if they're leaving campus to attend that college course or even if they're in the school. And if a state doesn't provide that, we heard from interviews and talking to people in research that it just places a financial burden on districts and maybe they won't want to offer dual enrollment. And similarly for community colleges, if there's not a financial incentive for them to offer dual enrollment, then they might not do it. And it might be, and if they do offer it just because it helps with like student enrollment or other things, then they have to subsidize those dual enrollment costs, which can also hurt their bottom line. So different pros and cons to states allocating additional funding. And so because there's so much differentiation and so many differences across the states for the dual enrollment funding models, instead of trying to do some like landscape analysis or try to identify some piecemeal themes, what we decided to do instead was to use a case study approach. And so we interviewed over 20 national and state experts on dual enrollment, and we decided that we wanted to dig into 4 distinct states to really get a good sense of how they do dual enrollment funding, and then identify themes from there. And so we identified 4 criteria from the literature base and our expert interviews on how are we going to choose the states that we were going to do our case studies on. And so the first thing is that the state has invested in dual enrollment in some capacity. So they provide additional funding, not just in their formulas, but additional funding on top of that to help districts and community college cover dual enrollment costs. We also wanted to make a criteria that the state has prioritized dual enrollment participation. So that could mean many different things. The state could have some type of state goal, or they could have an action plan, but the state has in some way committed to helping expand dual enrollment access, particularly for student marginalized groups. Students are not responsible for tuition costs. So we wanted to look at states where students or a subset of students were not responsible at all for paying tuition, but that the K-12 districts, community colleges in the state were the actors responsible for paying that. And then that also students were not responsible for non-tuition costs. And we didn't say every single non-tuition cost, but we wanted to look at the student was responsible for paying most or all or some of those non-tuition costs, like textbooks, fees. And so from our expert interviews, desk research, talking to people, and looking at their criteria and looking at different states, we identified 4 different states to do our case studies on. And so we have California, looking at their college and career access pathway program. So high school students can take college courses and earn credit in the earn high school credit and community college credit simultaneously at the high school for no cost. Idaho, their Advanced Opportunities Program, where every student is provided a maximum of $4,625 that they can use on a multitude of different programming, AP, IB, but also dual enrollment. Minnesota, which is where we'll also do a deep dive today, given the Western context. Minnesota was I knew a lot about it, but it was also just like fun to dig into because it has 3 different programs. We have to be unique in Minnesota. So they have concurrent enrollment, which is offered at the high school, offered at no cost, taught by teachers. Traditional PSEO, which is offered at an institution of higher education, including community college, taught by college faculty. And the tuition is covered through a statutory formula. And then PSEO by contract was like a hybrid of concurrent enrollment and traditional PSEO. I'll dig into more of that a little bit later. And then the Texas program, we also is new, but it's a really cool program we're looking at where in Texas, all economically disadvantaged students, so low-income students, their dual enrollment costs are covered. And then at the community college, they also redid their community college formula to create an incentive there for community college dual enrollment participation to get funding. So we did a deep dive into those 4 states and those programs. And then of the criteria, we said that every state we looked at had to have at least 3 of the criteria. So just pulling out Minnesota here, concurrent enrollment fits all of our criteria. So the state has invested additional money. The state has prioritized dual enrollment participation, and the students do not pay for the cost for dual enrollment or the non-tuition costs. And then for PSEO and PSEO by traditional PSEO and PSEO by contract, um, it hits all their criteria except for that the state has not invested additional monies into PSEO. And so each of our case studies examined 4 key areas. So we wanted to really hone in on the entity, so the state, the district, community college, or student who's responsible for covering the tuition and non-tuition costs. How the state includes dually enrolled students into their community college and K-12 funding formulas, right? We've all heard about decline in birth rates, enrollments going down, right? And enrollment is a huge driver of funding. So we really wanted to get a sense of how are dually enrolled students treated within these formulas to help fund community colleges and K-12 districts, because it's a question that we hadn't really seen answered in comprehensively, and we thought that was interesting to dig into. Whether the state provides additional funding in addition to the funding through those community college and K-12 formulas, and then also whether the state has seen an increase in dual enrollment, participation, and attainment since they've made some of these changes. And so we did find that for all 4 states, they've experienced significant growth in dual enrollment participation, but for different reasons. So the California seat cap legislation allowed high schools to offer community colleges in the high school that were not open to the public that previously had not been allowed. And by them allowing them to have specific courses dedicated to high school students that was not open to the public, you saw a huge growth in dual enrollment participation. In Idaho's case, they consolidated several different programs into like one consolidated program for everything, not just dual enrollment, but APIB. And so really spurred massive growth because you saw students being able to really drive their own choice and voice and how they wanted to participate in college and career programs. Minnesota's program is the oldest in the country, and so we have a lot of data to show that there's been a lot of growth, particularly in PSEO by contract over the last decade, and then also the P20 partnership has recently been accepted into a cohort. So they're currently really focusing on what's Minnesota's vision for dual enrollment in the future. And then for Texas's program, which made dual enrollment free for economically disadvantaged students, they saw a growth of about 150,000 students in 1 year after they implemented this program. And because there was so much growth in student participation for economically disadvantaged students, and they got community colleges got that funding, then some community colleges are also able to offer the programming to non-economically disadvantaged students for free. And so I'm going to do a Minnesota deep dive here, given the context. And so this is where, for concurrent enrollment, so in Minnesota, the state legislature allocates about $4 million in additional funding for concurrent enrollment on top of the K-12 and the funding that goes to the institutions of higher education. That is not the case for PSEO. PSEO does not get an additional allocation into what's already done in the formula. And when we think about has the state prioritized dual enrollment, so Minnesota, as I previously alluded to, was selected to participate in a C college in the high school alliance initiative, where they're going to work on expanding dual enrollment access, so setting a statewide vision to eliminate gaps, think about how we can change funding mechanisms, things like that. So that work has just kicked off and is just starting. And then for all 3 programs, students are not responsible for tuition or non-tuition costs. And so when we look at dual enrollment participation in Minnesota for the last 6 years, what we find is that dual enrollment programming has grown by about 9,000 students total since 2016. However, that growth has really been spurred by PSEO by contract. So PSEO by contract is not set in the in a statute, but rather the community college and the K-12 district create their own agreement, and they decide their own cost sharing agreement that's outside of the formula that's set in statute, which says that for a full-time student, the community college will get 88% of the K-12 formula, and districts only get that 12%. So to help districts kind of get more of that, recoup more of that funding, the community college and the district can make their own agreements. And so we see most of that growth is by PSEO by contract, and then also we see a slight increase in concurrent enrollment from about 30,000 to 32,500. But we have seen a decline in traditional PSEO, which is not surprising when you talk to people across districts that 88% formula, so that 80% requirement that the funding goes to institution of higher education, that's really a deterrent for a lot of districts to do the programming when they can do PSTO by contract and kind of create their own cost sharing agreement, because that's a lot of their funding that they're losing. And then there's just also other barriers, right, to students participating in terms of if a student leaves the school and goes to a traditional, a course on a traditional campus, right, they may lose some of their Food Price lunch status. Transportation isn't free, so there's a reimbursement system. So there's other barriers there too, but that cost sharing is a big one. When we broke this down and looked at student participation by race, even though traditional PSEO has seen a slight decline, it's also the most representational, meaning that the 9 to 12 enrollment is in alignment with the participation for that dual enrollment program. So when we look across, we do see that there are still gaps between, so looking here at the gold, this is the share of 9 to 12 enrollment in Minnesota for 2022. 23. But what we would want to see here is that these would be the same, right? So we see some representational enrollment for multiracial. We see pretty good representation here for PSEO, traditional PSEO, for Asian and Black students. And then we see that Latino students have a lower share. And then also looking at some of the research on attainment outcomes. To be frank, I would love to see more rigorous research done on attainment data with dual enrollment programming and following students through to and through college. I know it's hard to do. Longitudinal studies take a lot of time and effort. But we do see that in some of the studies that have been done, that there's research suggests that students who participate in dual enrollment versus students who don't in Minnesota tend to persist longer through college, particularly for economically disadvantaged students. And we know from some qualitative work, so some surveys, that students who take dual enrollment say that they feel more confident in their ability to take college classes. And so moving on to another poll question, and I'm going to wrap up here with some themes and recommendations. Just wondering, for people in the room, do you know, like, does your state provide full per pupil funding allocations? So like the full formula amount to K-12 districts and community college for dual enrollment? Or is it just, so A, is it yes, they fund it fully for both. They fund K-12 fully, but community college not all the way. C, they fund everything to community college, but not everything to K-12. D, neither. Or E, you don't know. I'd just love to get a sense of the room of what people are thinking. K-12 only, neither. Okay. Seeing a lot of K-12 only. Interesting. Okay. K-12 only or neither. That's interesting. Okay. Depends on the model. Yep, in Minnesota, depends on the model. Yep. Depends on who's offering. Okay. Yeah, this is interesting. So I'm seeing a mix though. I'm seeing a mix, right? So that's what I kind of alluded to earlier, that no two states fund dual enrollment the same way. And so thinking really about, okay, how do they fund how do they use dual enrollment, count them in their K-12 model and their community college model, and then think about funding on top of that. Because in a lot of work that I had seen, people focus on the funding that's on top of it, but not necessarily how are dually enrolled students treated in the actual formulas themselves, which do drive the bulk of the funding. So this is great. Thank you guys. So again, moving on, I want to wrap it up because I know I want to save time for questions. So thinking about policies and recommendations, when we looked across these 4 states and tried to derive some themes in what we were seeing, we found that some of the supportive funding policies throughout these 4 states was what we've kind of already said before. The student pays no tuition. The state allocates their full per pupil funding for dual enrollment students through that K to 12 formula. So to K to 12 districts, they get that full funding amount. They don't get some of it. Similarly, the state would give that full funding amount to the community college. And then we also saw state reimbursement for community college tuition. So the state either reimburses or partly reimburses community colleges for the dual enrollment tuition, and that can be through a flat credit rate or things like that. And then because funding doesn't work like by itself, right, in a silo. We also through our research, this wasn't the intent of what we were trying to do, but we did find that there were some themes too of just supportive policies that went beyond the funding. And so in three of the states, and Minnesota is working on this right now, so I want to give them credit for that. They have they have set state goals specific to dual enrollment, right? There's like a goal, there's something that they're working towards. We've also found very strong data reporting requirements, and that really helps to shine lights on transparency, on gaps, what's working, what's not working, right? The partnership agreements, so there is some floor minimum requirements in those agreements for the MOU, so it wasn't just that you can do whatever you want, but you have to have at least have these things in it. And then also some aligned coursework. So the state required that some of the dual enrollment programming also be aligned to credential value or workforce needs, which just helps make sure that there's that credits are able to transfer over for the students. Some challenges, which we saw in the chat earlier, that we found to increasing access. While there were state data reporting requirements, there are also some data limitations that we found in states, right? Some states don't fully disaggregate by race or disability type or things like that. Some of the data are in PDFs that are hard to transfer over. And so that's just a huge barrier when we're thinking about trying to synthesize and come up with create identify problems or identify areas of success, right? We also found that in some states they allow additional eligibility criteria on top of what's in statute, and that can really vary by institution type, which can make it hard for the student or the district to really figure out okay, what do you have to do to go to this community college versus the community college. The biggest issue we kept hearing, though, was about instructor capacity. There's just not enough teachers who meet the minimum requirements to teach dual enrollment. And so that was a huge issue that we kept hearing about, particularly in rural areas, which already tend to have larger issues with recruiting and retaining teachers. And then we also found there was another common barrier to just lack of college advising. So it's not just everything shouldn't be on the teacher to help a student navigate the system, but also a college counselor should be able to help them. And so we found just, without a lot of without a lot of counselors, it's just harder to do that. And so some recommendations we have, they're not as specific as we wanted to get, because we really want this to be more of here are some models that you can look to and then really do what's best for your state, but just support student participation. So really, if you can, use state funds so that students have to pay tuition and non-tuition costs. And if you can't do all students, think about that Texas model of really targeting that funding to students most in need. Invest in growing the instructor workforce so that you can actually have the instructors to meet the requirements so you can offer the courses. Support district and IT participation by ensuring your funding structures fairly support both both IHEs and districts in actually having the funding so they can offer these programmings. Ensure sustainable state funding. So don't just have a 1-year grant that the allocation is up to the legislature, but really just try to bake it into your actual formula. And then monitor impact and inform continuous improvement. So making sure that you have data requirements and data systems to support districts and states so that they can meet those data requirements, and then actually using that data to help inform continuous improvement instead of it just being another paper that's on a shelf. So that's all I have. I went a little over, apologies, but I would love to transition over to the Q&A. These are my two amazing co-authors on the paper. So these are emails. If you want to, happy to answer questions, reach out. We have data analysis, research. But yeah, thank you all. Would love to now just switch it over to, if you have any questions.
Well,
So,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, so please do use the Q&A box as you're able to get your questions in there, and we'll try to kind of answer them. Doesn't seem like we have that many questions so far. I think probably because your slides were so dense and you gave us so much information. Just trying to unpack some of that though, just I often like to, what surprised you, right? You're well versed in this coming into the project.
Mhm.
Right? Like what were some of the things that you kind of wanted to draw out? I know we asked you to focus specifically on Minnesota just because of the nature of our, our region,
Mhm.
but yeah, I'm interested to hear kind of what was surprising to you in terms of what the findings revealed.
Yeah, I was very surprised at Texas's program, their FAST program. So as I said before, Texas's program, they providing uh, instead of saying that all students don't have to pay tuition, they really focused on economically disadvantaged students, and the growth that they saw. I mean, an increase of 150,000 students, economically disadvantaged students, participating in 1 year, just seems like a really impactful use of state funding, because, like I said before, by them being able to offer that program, but then also they changed their community college formula. So now their community college formula has a incentive. So for every student who gets 15 credits of every K to 12 student who gets 15 dual enrollment credits, you get additional funding. By kind of having that like together, they saw a huge increase in funding and participation and attainment. But then because community colleges were getting this additional funding, they could then offer the dual enrollment for free to a lot of their students. And also, Texas instituted a cap, a credit cap. I think it was like $52 per credit, far below what would normally be. So they're still seeing an increase of everyone participating, but they really targeted that funding to the students most in need. It really is cool if people haven't heard about it. The success rates. So this is a great question. So this program is brand new. It started like 2013. So there hasn't been a ton of longitudinal data or studies on that. There have been studies before on Texas, which have found that their dual enrollment programs do participation in dual enrollment does lead to higher graduation rates, higher rates in post-secondary, attending and attainment. But this is one thing that I would love. I would love for more and better research on dual enrollment, participation, and attainment. I know it's hard to do. It can get noisy because it's the question of, well, would a student participated in anyway if they're already college going, things like that. But there haven't been a ton of like, at least from what I've found recently, studies on this. And so some of the research we were pulling from was a little old, right? Like 2021, 2019, things like that. So I would love to see more robust research on it. But to answer the actual question, instead of just keeping you talking, yes, Texas's program, pre these changes, did see positive attainment rates, attainment outcomes.
Wonderful. We do have a few different questions in the Q&A box too. I kind of want to
Mm,
jump around a little bit just because
mhm,
when you're talking about targeting specific populations in need, we heard a lot at the policy research at the policy workshop about rural students, right? And
mhm.
someone has asked, do you see any programs that specifically service or target rural students?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from these four states, there wasn't like a specific focus on rural students. However, I know for like Idaho, the programming, their program, their Advanced Opportunities program, they still have some issues in that area, but they do see some pretty good participation in rural students because students get this $4,625. They can choose which type of college and career readiness program they want to participate in. And so students can choose to take like an online college course. There are some stipulations around, if it's in Idaho, you don't have to pay for like the difference between fees, but if you leave the state, there's like some technicalities there. But by allowing the students to choose to be able to take an online dual enrollment course, they have seen that that is a way that they address that barrier, but it wasn't designed for that exact purpose. It's just the nature of the program is really student and family driven. Um, so but I know Minnesota does have some additional funding to help teachers get credentialed. And I know that one of the services of that is a service cooperative that is in rural Minnesota. And so, again, not specifically focused on rural in that way, but like by allowing the funding to be focused on shortage areas by nature, that's going to be in a rural area. Do you want me to prioritize any of these other questions, Carrie?
No, I just want to make sure that you
Yeah.
have, yeah, you have what you need. I know the
Yep.
Rebecca Larson is part of our action
Yeah.
planning team in Wisconsin, so happy to have her question next in the chat there. Let me just read it out for the sake of
Sure.
accessibility. I know you focused mainly on community college program funding models. Do you have any information to share on participation in programs at four-year public and private nonprofit institutions?
Yes. Unfortunately, my answer is not going to be satisfactory. I could get that for you, so I can pull it if you want to follow up with you, Rebecca. But we really just focused on uh, community colleges for this report. So for a different research project I did last year, I know I looked at this a bit. So if you want to follow up with me, I can pull it for you, but I do not have that now. Apologies. Yes, feel free to follow up. Um, So I'm looking back at the Q&A, seeing, so one of the questions was about like, is there data on difference in college going rates, associate's degrees versus bachelor's when funding was increased or decreased? That is a great question. To my knowledge, I do not know any data on this. I do know there is data broken down that shows dual enrollment students and where they do go, like if they are receiving a certificate, associate's degree, or a bachelor's. But I don't know if there's like that cross subsection of like if funding was increased or decreased. Another great study that could happen. But Jamie, if you want to follow up with me, I can point you to some good resources. The Community College Research Center at Columbia University has really great, rich data on this. I'd be happy to share whatever resources I can to help you with that, because I think there's a way to do it because there's longitudinal data. It's just to my knowledge, I haven't seen that. I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't seen research on that. And then the other question was, do you know the extent of paid faculty mentorship for high school teachers teaching concurrent enrollment? $57 seems low for maintaining a quality concurrent enrollment program. Uh, yes. So this was another thing that came up of their in the agreement. So thinking about California, so in the agreement, there has to be an agreement of like the type of like mentorship and activities that are going to happen between the IHE faculty versus the district. And so for some places, they come up with their own costs, and so the $57 for a credit is low, but the state does offer some of those other incentives baked in to provide additional funding. Um, and to your point about high quality concurrent enrollment program, I think that's such a good point because yes, you do need to have like adequate funding, um, but you also need to have some of those other supportive policies I talked about, right? In terms of making sure that you have some floors and things in your MOUs, making sure that your credentials, like what the credits that students are earning, can actually be transferred over, that they're not just like earning credits in perpetuity. And in Idaho, there was a point about like because students can choose where they go, there's some issues with like so many different transcripts and like making sure that students are identifying those. Um, so I do think like funding needs to be adequate, but the extent of the mentorship, I think it really just depends on the type of on the agreement and on the institution and the K-12 district and how they're working together. And then when the funding follows the student, does the money go directly to the institution? Yes. So this is a great question. So yes. So for example, um, in for example, when it works, so funding follows the student. So what happens is that if a student, let's just do Minnesota, and we'll do concurrent enrollment. So a student who's doing concurrent enrollment in a school in Minnesota, that school will get the full funding for that student, and then they'll get the full state funding for that student, and then they will work out an agreement with the institution of higher education and figure out what they're going to actually pay the institution of higher education for that student. So even if the student is like taking that college course in the high school, the funding doesn't go directly to the institution of higher education. It's worked out in the memorandum of understanding. And in Minnesota, we don't have a formula in the way that some other states do for institutions of higher education. So if you think about California, in California, if a student participates in their CCAP program, then yes, the full K-12 funding goes to the district as long as the student participates in just K-12 education for 240 minutes a day. The full community college formula amount goes to the community college that is running the dual enrollment program. And then the memorandum of understanding is just kind of working out some of like the more details of like, okay, supports and things like that, but they get the full, they each get the full funding amount. So it also like depends though, because like I said, dual enrollment funding is different by state. So it kind of depends on how it kind of depends how the state has worked out how they're funding the dually enrolled student in their K to 12 and community college formulas, and then also then what's required in the MOU. So it depends. It's my long-winded way of saying it depends. Sorry.
No, wait, that's always yes.
Yes, Carrie put the CCRC link in the chat. That is a wealth of data. They are amazing. They are doing great work on dual enrollment. They're top notch. Yeah.
Anytime I get to sing their praises, I will take advantage of it.
Yes, they are amazing.
So
They're one of the, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I just have, so we coming out of the summer action planning that we did with the state team. So we brought together 11 state teams, talk about dual enrollment in terms of current state of policy and practice, and then, kind of forward looking. So action plans in each of the states. Obviously different areas of emphasis for everyone, but I'm just curious about, I mean, we heard similar things, right? Tight budgets, misaligned systems, siloing. So what advice would you give states who I think maybe see the barriers but are looking for the opportunities, right? So like what do you think, is there a light at the end of the tunnel for folks who are working through this and really committed to increasing access, but are coming up against those challenges that, I mean, you named really well in the previous slides?
Yeah. I always try to be glasses half full type of person. So I do think yes, there's hope. I think I mean, it depends on where states are at, but what I would do is kind of take an inventory of your current dual enrollment system. I know some states have multiple different programs. California, we just called out CCAP. They have 3 other programs, right? So I would take an inventory of, okay, what are our programs? How are they funded through our K to 12 formula and through our higher ed or community college formula? Understanding how that money works, I think is so like step 1 is so important because there's the argument, right, of like double funding or double dipping, right? And so really understanding how does like the state and how does the monies that the state already allocates to K to 12 and high institution of higher education, how does that interact with dual enrollment students? I would say that's number 1. Next, I would then look at, okay, does our state provide any additional type funding? What are the policies involved for that funding, right? So does the student have to pay? Do we have to pay, et cetera? You probably already know this, but just like lay it out, right? So you actually have a map of like, okay, this is what the realities of our situation are. And then I would pull data. I would pull your program data to show, okay, are we seeing increases in enrollment? Are we seeing decreases? Where are we seeing increases? Do we have any type of data, either a survey or something that can show like that this program is worth it? And then I would look at states that, talk to other people who are doing things that you think are maybe cool or innovative or that are alignment more with your values. I should have said this. You should start also too with like, what are your values? What's your mission statement? What are your goals? Like, what do you want the program to do? Then that can help drive kind of where you go. But I do think like having a very clear understanding of the realities of like, this is where we want to go. This is where we are. This is currently all the ways that we're supposed to get there. This is how we want to get there. is a good way to really think about, okay, how can we make some really like some changes, right? So like in Idaho, when they completely consolidated all their programming, they realized we have so many piecemeal programs, we want to consolidate these. And so they started talking to people and they did it, right? In Minnesota, right, they're doing right now, they're doing more of like the working group, like talking to people, setting a vision, and that could hopefully lead to policy change. California, their policy change happened um through, I mean, it was a lot of work, but they've really like set like really accountability into their statute because there had been some issues prior with some dual enrollment and like some iffy things with funding. So they put like accountability metrics and goals into statute and really were very clear in what they wanted. And then they've made continuous improvement along the way. So I think like figuring out, like I said, in summary, can you tell I kind of like to talk in summary, thinking about like being clear on like what's your mission statement, what are your goals, what are your values, getting very clear on like what's the current state of your programming and your policies, thinking about where you want to go and thinking about, okay, what are the things we actually need to change, what are the levers we need to pull to get there.
Sage advice. No, absolutely. That is, I think, very helpful because a lot of the dialogue we were hearing is like where to start, right? Like this is just an overwhelming
Yeah.
situation. And so I think
Yeah.
those are really some great actionable steps that
Okay.
everyone could take
Thanks.
and benefit from. So I have a selfish question since there are no
Sure.
more questions in the Q&A, but please do
Okay.
feel free, those who are hanging on with us here, to add some more. We definitely have a bit of time, but I have a vested interest in workforce alignment and just am
Mhm.
interested in that aspect. So I wonder if you feel, I mean, the report highlights workforce alignment or credential relevance, but are there risks of overemphasizing that
Mhm.
alignment? Like, are we narrowing student out options or limiting transferability, those kinds of things? I'm just curious from your perspective. I mean, I know it's
Mhm.
important, but I think we're
Yeah.
all trying to walk that line of how important.
Yeah. I do think I appreciate the question and I do very much agree with the hesitation. I think like if you're going to do that, you need to also then have regular audits or updates to the list or to the credits to make sure that you're not, like we're in a situation right now, right, where we told all these students majoring in computer science, and now these students, a lot of students who graduated can't get jobs because AI and whatnot. So I do think if we're going to align things to credentials or values or the workplace, that we need to also be updating that and keeping an eye on it and edit and making sure that it's being updated to be relevant still. Um, I do think that if something a pro to doing that though is that what I mean Minnesota had its own audit where you had all these students who were getting these credentials who are earning, particularly in CTE credentials that were just like outdated that no one needed, right? It wasn't aligned. And so I think if you're trying to do that workforce alignment, it can't just be like, okay, we looked at some data. You need to talk to businesses, talk to your data, talk to like what is the capacity also of districts. You also don't want to be help you don't want to be forcing districts or schools to constantly have to change and adapt to a lot of things. So it's like, what's your capacity? There's a lot of like front work that needs to be done to make sure the alignment is done well. And so that students are getting credentials that they can actually use. And also with that too, I also think it's important to, Texas did this to ensure that like if a student is maybe earning like a general credit or something, that also aligns with an institution of higher education that they can transfer over. Because even then, if it's not like a workforce alignment, it's aligning to the generals in the institution of higher education. So it's transferable in that way too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the question, right? There's that intersection of, yeah, how do we bring these credentials into
Yeah.
bearing pathways or credit for prior learn, right? Like there's
Right.
all these different kinds of things that then open up.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think you gave everybody a lot to think about, I have to say. You did a good job answering very pointed questions and lots of good information. And really, you do just scratch the surface of what's in the report because
Yeah.
there is a deep dive into various states, not, glancingly mentioned here, but not focused on. So, no, I really appreciate this. I don't see that we have any other questions.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, so let me just thank you
Thank you.
for joining us. A huge thank you to you for sharing your research with us. And we ask that those of you who continued on with us, please do complete our survey. The survey will be available when you exit the webinar, and the link will also be placed in the chat. We've already posted the presentation because Mary is that good. So we'll post the recording of today's event on the website as soon as it's available. And we hope that you'll keep informed with MEC by subscribing to our monthly newsletter. And then there's also various options there for particular areas of interest. So thank you all for joining us, and see you next time. Take care.